In the United States of America, every year, gun violence claims thousands of lives. Many of these casualties, their children, innocent kids that do not know good from bad. But gun violence has permeated every aspect of American life. A church, a grocery store, concerts, schools, you name it. And the recent spate of mass shootings has once again reignited the debate on gun control and laws. So what is stopping America from taking decisive, effective steps? As per Pew Research, at least 4 in 10 American adults say they live in a household with a gun. That includes some 30% who say they personally own one. Hello and welcome. My name is Hemkor Saroya, and in the next half an hour, we shall try to decode gun violence in the United States and the hurdles the country faces to overcome it.
Some of her best friends passed with her.
Those whose lives were taken did nothing to deserve their fate.
This is a political choice that we make to allow this to happen every few months in America.
As a nation, we have to ask, when in God's name are we going to stand up to the gun lobby?
Let's start with some facts. We are 6 months into the year, and in these months, there have been over 250 mass shootings in America already. The kids who get excited for ice creams and sports breaks, they also fall prey to America's gun terror. More than 2,500 children, teenagers, have been shot by America's gun terrorists. In response to the recent deadly and unjustified gun shooting, the United States House has passed a wide-ranging gun control bill. What does this entail? Raising the minimum age for purchasing certain firearms from 18 to 21. It also toughens prohibitions on untraceable guns. The legislation passed by a vote of 223 to 204. The push comes after a House committee heard emotional testimonies from recent shooting victims and family members. We got a chilling account from the recent mass shooting in a Texas school when the 18-year-old gunman opened fire. Mia Carrillo played dead by smearing herself with a murdered friend's blood. Mia is just 11 years old. Needless to say, she is still grappling with nightmares and the trauma of the incident. She was asked a few questions in a pre-recorded testimony. Listen in.
When I went to the barracks, he shot my friend that was next to me, and I thought he was going to come back to the room, so I grabbed the blood and put it all over me. And
what did you do then when you put the blood on yourself?
just stay quiet, and then I got my teacher's phone and called 911.
And what did you tell 911?
I told her that we need help and to send the police in our classroom.
This is not the first time the United States Congress has reacted to a mass shooting by proposing legislation. The Protecting Our Kids Act, though passed in the lower house, does not have optimistic chances of being passed in the Senate. And it's not surprising. Here's a look at decades worth of failed efforts in Congress to address gun violence after mass shootings. Starting with the worst mass shooting in a school in America's history. 26 people were killed, including 20 children, in Sandy Hook Elementary School. President Obama called for action and a bill was proposed to increase background checks on gun buyers. It failed to get the votes in the Senate. In 2015, 14 people were killed in San Bernardino. This time, both Democrats and Republicans proposed some gun control measures. All of them failed to get the votes needed to be passed in Congress. In 2016, 49 people died in a nightclub in Orlando. This time, 4 proposals were made, all of them similar to the ones made before, extending background checks, not allowing people on terrorist watch lists to buy guns, but all of them failed to pass in Senate. There was only one time that Congress acted successfully. Also in 2017, 26 people were killed in church in Sutherland Springs. Congress proposed and passed the Fix NICS Act. It made modest improvements on background checks and was backed by the NRA. President Trump signed into law in 2018. So does this protect our kids have any chance of being signed into law? History would say the chances are slim. A poll conducted in the aftermath of the Texas shooting by CBS and YouGov showed that nearly half of Republican voters think the country has to just live with mass shootings. And for more on this, we're now being joined by Mr. Spencer Crishley. Mr. Crishley has worked with former US President Barack Obama and also has experience in gun violence reduction. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Crishley.
My pleasure.
Now, if we talk about other countries that have similar rate of gun ownership in comparison to the United States, we don't necessarily see the same number of violent crimes, say like in countries like Finland. So what do you think drives gun violence? Easy access, we know, is one reason. Do you think there are other factors involved?
It's hard to know for certain because one of the things the gun lobby has been preventing is the conducting of research into gun violence because they really don't want people to know for sure. They exist really to serve the interests of gun sellers, not gun owners, and their whole focus is maximizing profits no matter the expense, unfortunately. But based on the data that we do have, the strongest correlation we see is easy availability of guns and the high level of gun violence. We see that across the 50 states in the United States. Where it's harder to get a gun, you have lower gun violence. Where it's easier, you have higher gun violence. And although there are other countries that have similar rates of gun ownership, I don't think anybody quite matches us. We have far more guns than people in this country. Those comparisons are not apples to apples, as it were. In Switzerland, for example, it's very common to own a gun, but the level of training is much higher, and it's not necessarily as easy to get hold of ammunition. In the United States, we have these extreme gun radicals who don't want to have any even training requirements to own assault weapons, and I think that makes us exceptional in the worst way in this case.
Right. Now, it is said that with technological advances, gun control, that may become even harder. What is your take on the same?
Yes, of course, with these ghost guns, and these kits to make guns yourself, it'll presumably get that much more difficult. This debate actually is not really a debate anymore in this country, unfortunately. Like so much else in our politics, it's almost entirely symbolic, especially on the right. The United States, in my view, and I go into this in detail in my book, is kind of suffering from a split consciousness where half the country tends to be trapped in its head, and that would be liberals, the left, the Democrats on my side of the fence. And the right is increasingly living in a world of mysticism and symbolism and is separated from rational thought, and a complete human being needs both. And so, unfortunately, the gun issue, like so many other issues in the United States, is largely symbolic. And, my side can quote facts and figures about how to reduce gun violence all day long. But on the right, it's much more a question of symbolism about freedom and personal safety and this sort of thing, much of which doesn't actually make any sense, but that's not really the point.
Right. Now, when we speak of gun control, do you think increasing the minimum age for purchasing weapons, that is enough? Is it perhaps time to build a more efficient background check system and infrastructure that is more deliberate and thorough?
Yes, it clearly is. And, this is where I say that none of this is rational. The right-wing position on this, the radical pro-gun position, and I want to separate that from the position of responsible gun owners because, like it or not, the United States does have a Second Amendment that does have a long tradition behind it of protecting gun rights, but always in conjunction with responsibility. However, the radical pro-gun people want no limitations whatsoever, which is irrational. I mean, you have a right in this country to move around and to own a car, but you don't have a right to drive a tank down the street or to drive an enormous truck without being licensed to drive that truck. And yet, for some reason, with guns, one of the most dangerous products you could possibly buy, the radical pro-gun people don't want the slightest restriction, even, preventing an 18-year-old, a mentally disturbed 18-year-old, from buying an AR-15.
Right, Mr. Spencer Critchley, thank you so much for joining us with your insights on the same.
My pleasure, thank you.
Speaking of responses, let's talk about one that has sparked another debate. In the aftermath of the Uvalde school massacre, schools across the United States, they saw an increase in police presence. Can more police presence act as an effective deterrent to school shootings? What impact does police presence have on young children? Is policing young children the way to discipline and protect them? Let's take a look. In the week following the Texas school massacre, schools across the state saw increased police presence. In a bid to tackle the surge in gun violence, 2 states, Ohio and Louisiana, are now mulling giving teachers weapons. But what does this mean? More guns. Ohio is set to enact a law that lets teachers carry guns in classrooms after 24 hours of initial training. Their hope is that armed teachers can help reduce the frequency of violent gun crimes. At the National Rifle Association in Texas, held just 3 days after the Uvalde school massacre, CEO Wayne LePere called for arming school teachers and officers in schools. Again, a solution that would require more guns. It has been seen that in incidents of mass shooting, police presence has barely had any impact on reducing the frequency or the severity of such incidents. On the other hand, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that having more guns around school children and deploying school resource officers is a misplaced response to the gun epidemic in the United States. As per the American Civil Liberties Union, it has been observed that having school resource officers does not just mean increased police presence, but also disproportionate allocation of funds. As per an ACLU report, more than 14 million students were in schools with police presence, but no access to nurses, counselors, psychologists, or social workers. Another study, which took into account over 179 shootings in schools over the course of 19 years, showed that having a police officer did little to nothing to help reduce the severity of the shootings. That is not all. Studies also point to the fact that having school resource officers around children poses a greater risk to them, especially to students with disabilities and students of color. In the period from 2017 to 2018, it was recorded that over 54,000 students were arrested. Why? Some charged with assault, some for throwing paper planes, flinging skittles. A 5-year-old child with ADHD was arrested for throwing a fit. Most of these officers are not trained enough to deal with children. They behave with children as they would during normal patrol elsewhere. The problem here is guns, and having more guns on school property is not a long-term solution. Bureau Report WION, World is One. Now, to discuss the proposal of police presence in schools, we are now being joined by Dr. Joel Dworkin, clinical and forensic psychologist at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. Welcome to the broadcast. What is your take on having more school resource officers in schools? Do you think it is an effective strategy?
The research on school resource officers is somewhat mixed, but in general, it doesn't show that schools are any safer. And there's some negative effects of resource officers, which is it can lead to higher number of arrests and higher number of suspensions in schools. Those are not good things. School resource officers, there are some downsides to school resource officers. It makes it much easier to arrest a child. It lowers the threshold for when you should think about arrest or suspension. And some studies have shown that school resource officers can increase the number of arrests and suspensions of children. That doesn't mean that there should never be a school resource officer. If in a particular school for a particular purpose, it may be a good idea if you select the right person to be a school resource officer, make sure that they're trained, make sure that they work collaboratively with the school officials rather than I'm the police and I'll tell you what's going to happen. So I think the correct answer is what's needed is common sense.
Right. All right, let's just bring in another important element of this discussion. Do stay on with us, Dr. Joel Dworkin. No discussion on gun controls. It's complete without talking about America's love for the Second Amendment. Any call to repeal or change it, it is met with fierce opposition from the NRA, Washington's power chambers, even the American public. Right after the Texas shooting, this is what President Joe Biden had to say about the Second Amendment.
Second Amendment's not absolute. When it was passed, you couldn't own a cannon. You couldn't own certain kinds of weapons. It's just always been limitations.
Now, Biden says the Second Amendment is not absolute. The president's comments drew intense criticism almost immediately. Both conservatives, gun rights activists slammed him. They said the Second Amendment cannot be infringed. This is what the Second Amendment says. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The primary aim of the Second Amendment was to prevent the United States from starting a professional army. In fact, it was the single most important goal of the Second Amendment. This is difficult to imagine today. The United States has one of the largest armies in the world. Another important fact here is that it was never concerned with individual rights. It's not like the founding fathers were against the idea of an individual right to bear arms. It's just that it was not an issue that concerned them at the time. So while the gun rights lobby cites the Second Amendment to justify gun laws, the fact is the Second Amendment never really cared about individual rights. So the argument that the Second Amendment is sacrosanct, it's flawed. America's founding fathers had a vision that armed citizens are ultimate guarantors of freedom. But that has now become the reason behind America's gun problem. Thank you so much for staying with us, Dr. Dworkin. Is there any way gun reform laws can be brought about without violating the Second Amendment laws?
Some of the ways to do it are relatively simple suggestions that do not interfere with the Second Amendment right to bear arms. For example, causing a 3-day delay when you have to buy a gun means that if someone is suicidal and they can run out and get a gun in 30 minutes, the chances that they're going to die is much higher. If they're suicidal and it takes them 3 days to get their gun, in 3 days, most people are not still suicidal. They think of other ways to end their pain. Another example are the red flag laws, where if police come to a home, often for a domestic violence call, and there are threats, death threats or threats of violence, and the police say, you know what, maybe we'll take your guns for a few days. And a week later, the person can get their guns back. Now you've allowed time for the situation to cool down, and it doesn't work in all cases, but it might work in some. And so those are simple suggestions that would respect the right to bear arms. Another one is to make sure that everybody has to have a background check before they buy a gun, and to take some of the loopholes away. And that means that anybody who's a legitimate gun owner will pass the background check and they'll buy their guns. It won't be any restriction whatsoever on their right to own guns, but it may prevent somebody who would fail a background check from getting a gun at a gun sale or in a private sale.
Right. Dr. Roskin, thank you so much for joining us with your assessment. Now, we cannot talk about gun violence and gun control without talking about this. The National Rifle Association. These mass shootings have brought into question the role of the National Rifle Association, a monolith in the United States. The group was founded in 1871 by two U.S. Civil War veterans. It was meant to be a recreational group designed to promote and encourage rifle shootings. Things slowly changed in 1934. NRA slowly started stepping its toes into political lobbying. It started writing to its members. Most of this was information about upcoming firearms bills. Currently, the NRA is the most powerful lobby in the United States. It has the budget, it has the power, and it continues to influence members of the US Congress on gun policy. In 2020, the NRA spent about $250 million in just a year. It spends approximately $3 million every year to influence gun policy. What the NRA lobbies against is all forms of gun control. The organization currently has over 5 million members. It boasts of powerful members. The NRA's gun rights ideology, very simple. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. It's an ideology that is now entrenched in American politics, a vision that armed citizens are the ultimate guarantors of freedom. Just the sheer number of mass shootings in the United States can make one numb to the tragedy of the killings. But let's just take a look at some of the emotional, moving pleas made by heartbroken, distraught parents of the victims of Robb Elementary School in Texas.
I don't know what to do because I think I would have lost my baby girl. My baby girl is the world, 'cause not only once, but twice. She came back to us. She's everything, not only for me, but her siblings and her mother.
My granddaughter was in here. She was an innocent little girl. Loving school and looking forward for summer. And she didn't get to do that. And my heart hurts because I will never ever again. I will never have my baby again.
Who screwed up? If they could tell me, oh, we made a mistake, we went the wrong decision, but my great-granddaughter is not coming back to me. She's not coming back to me. And if we keep going the way we're going, we're going to have more school kids that are innocent. They don't have, in the room, they don't have a gun, they have crayons.
I told her we loved her and we would pick her up after school. I can still see her walking with us toward the exit. In the reel that keeps scrolling across my memories, she turns her head and smiles back at us to acknowledge my promise. And then we left. I left my daughter at that school, and that decision will haunt me for the rest of my life.
Words can't describe how hard it is to bury a child. I ache for anyone and all who have done the same. My son's death was a result of a criminal with an evil heart and a justice system failing to hold him accountable for the laws he had already broken.
Now, before we end the show, let's take you through some more numbers. 100, that is the number of people killed every day by guns in the United States. 12, the number of children who die every day from gun violence. 18 to 21, peak ages of violent gun offenders. 8 million, the number of AR-15s and their variations currently in circulation in the United States. As America squirms to find a solution, hundreds of lives are lost every day. What America needs is not misapplied and reactionary measures, but long-term, well-planned solutions. And with that, we call it a wrap on this edition of The Bulletin. Thank you for watching WION World is One. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.